Well, good evening, everyone. Great to have you. I'm going to ask you to share this. We are going to have an amazing conversation. You are on Breaking the Silence with Bishop Bonnie, and we're excited to have you here. We are about to have conversation, and we are going to have we're going to hold sacred space tonight for healing, honesty, and hope. And that's what Breaking the Silence is all about. So I'm going to ask you in just a moment to share this to your platforms, please, and like. We're on YouTube, we're on Facebook, and Instagram. So we're glad to have you with us on tonight. We have a great show planned for you, and I'm so excited. It's a lot of you may or may not know that it's National Depression Education Awareness Month. A whole lot of words. I know that you can go on the internet and find that there are 25 other things that this month is about. But knowing that how depression has really affected many folks' lives, especially where we are in the world today. A lot of folks are in deep distress, and that distress is causing them to be in depression. And so tonight we have a great guest with us tonight that's going to help us unpack that. We have some questions. We're going to ask you to put those questions in the comments. We'll keep watching for them. I see you, Minister Sandy. Great to have you with us. I look forward to seeing you this weekend right there in Southern California. I'm going to be there at your installation. But welcome, friends, again to another powerful conversation on Breaking the Silence. Where we hold again sacred space for healing, honesty, and hope. Hey, AC, and again, I'm Bishop Bonnie and Radden, and tonight during Depression Awareness Month, Education Month, we're leaning into into one of the most important conversations, I believe, right now of our time: understanding depression and breaking the stigma that surrounds it. Understanding it and breaking the stigma around it. Our theme tonight is from silence to strength. From silence to strength, confronting depression with courage and compassion. Now, we know, I don't care who you are, you can tell me, oh no, Bishop, that doesn't happen. Depression touches every community, every generation, and every home. I've lived enough to know that, right? Yet, too often, what's happened is it's met with silence or shame, particularly in the church. Can somebody say amen right there? But here tonight on Breaking the Silence, we choose compassion over judgment, truth over fear, and healing over hiding. Come on, somebody. Healing over hiding. I'm deeply honored tonight to welcome my special guest. I'm so excited to have her with me tonight. A brilliant mind, I believe, a compassionate spirit, and a true advocate for healing. Would you help me welcome right now the Reverend Dr. DeAnza Spaulding? Yay! Hey, Reverend Doctor, great to have you with us on tonight. Can you say hello to our guests?
Good evening, everyone. Welcome into this wonderful time to talk about a conversation that is so important for our health.
Amen. Amen. Well, let me tell all of you who this wonderful human being is. Reverend Dr. DeAnza J. Spaulding is the pastor of Table Turning and Congregational Care and the founder of Renew Therapy and Consolation. She is a trauma therapist, yay, so am I, whose practice centers the mental health and healing of the BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities, with a special focus on domestic violence. Come on, somebody. Internalized oppression and intergenerational trauma, something I've been studying for the last 3 years. Dr. Spaulding holds degrees in sociology, counseling psychology, international psychology, and serves as a professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. as well as an adjunct professor at the Seattle Institute of East Asian Medicine. Wow. I'm just, Dr. Spaulding, just into uh, a lot of really holistic health right now, juicing. We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But, amen. Her research and advocacy have taken her around the world, from Seattle to Istanbul to Peru and Thailand, always centering the voices of those who have been silenced. Wow. Been around the world a little bit, my friend. Let's see what else we have to say about you. Uh, Reverend Doctor is currently working on her forthcoming book. What if I told you there was nothing wrong with you? And I can't wait. Racism and the stigma of mental health. Dr. DeAnza, I want to thank you tonight for being here and for the work that you do that continues to transform lives and communities. Wow, that's a whole lot, y'all, a whole lot. Well, we're not going to waste any time. We're going to get right into our questions. First off, about understanding depression. And so, Reverend Doctor, I want to ask you, as a trauma therapist, how do you define depression? And what are some signs that we may often overlook, particularly in the church and particularly in communities of color? Help
Mhm.
us do that.
Well, I first just want to say thank you, Bishop Bonnie, for that beautiful introduction and for welcoming me here on your show, Breaking the Silence. And it's a deep honor to be here, and it's a deep honor to be a part of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries and
Amen.
Radical Inclusion, which ultimately I think is what we're talking about when we're talking about mental health, is how we can radically include all the parts of ourselves into community.
Amen.
And I am so aware that this conversation right now is so vitally important. It's
Yeah,
just so important, and that it's one that we often overlook, and that is deeply stigmatized in our society. And we have a lot of fear around talking about depression. Um, and I'm also very aware that this conversation brings up a lot of vulnerability and tenderness for people coming
absolutely.
into space. And so I want to just start by saying that one of the things that I do when I'm entering into a sacred conversation like this is acknowledge that we are standing on holy ground, and
Hallelujah.
that as we are standing on this holy place, this holy conversation around our mental health, that we can literally and figuratively take off our shoes to honor our bodies, to honor each other, and to honor what we bring into space together tonight. I also believe that on holy ground, we are changed because we are open to new perspectives and fresh ideas. And that what I've come to learn as I've continued to grow older, that when I'm faced with truth, I can't go without, I can't unsee truth once I'm confronted with truth.
Yes.
And so I pray that tonight is an opportunity for us to have fresh perspectives and new truths that ultimately honor who we are in the world. And so I welcome each one of you that are entering into this space, wherever you are on your journey as well. May you feel honored and be honored in this place tonight. The definition of depression is a mental health condition that is characterized by sadness, by despair, by hopelessness, um, people feeling like they're unworthy or not enough, low self-esteem or low self-worth is what some people might call it. People also experience ruminating thoughts, where they have these thoughts
Yeah.
that feel like they're running on a loop and just saying kind of negative messages that continue to be repeated back towards themselves over and over. People will describe feeling foggy, like they have foggy brain, like it's hard
Yeah.
to think, it's difficult to think, like there's a cloud over their head, and that it's hard to concentrate. And people will also describe feeling like there is literally a weight on their chest. There's a pressure on them when they're feeling depressed. It can make it difficult to get out of bed. It can make it difficult to do the things that one enjoys doing. It can make it difficult to be with family and friends and community and so on. And so it can also feel very isolating when one is going through depression.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the symptoms of depression can be so extreme that it can lead to suicidal ideation. And so I'm saying this, and I'm saying this with a lot of emphasis and very carefully, because I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge when we're thinking about depression and coming to an understanding around depression is that it is deeply painful.
Yeah.
It is a deeply painful condition, and that people feel isolated. A lot of times, folks will describe to me feeling like they are a wheel that's stuck in a mud pit and they're
Mm.
pushing on the gas pedal and it just keeps spinning and spinning
Uh,
and spinning, and they're getting deeper and deeper in that pit. And sometimes, what I hear when they're describing this to me is not only that they're the wheel in the pit, but they themselves are in the pit and they have a rock on top of them that is weighing them down. And so they're trying to get out of this pit, but they feel weighed down by this rock, and it just continues to deepen and deepen and deepen
mhm.
deeper into this pit. And so just that, just that image alone can help us understand just how difficult depression can be to live with and how painful it can feel, how isolating it can feel. Depression impacts many people in our society. Statistically, 1 out of 4 people, I actually think the statistics are higher than that because most people don't share that they're dealing with depression because of the stigma and the shame and the silencing.
Right.
And we know that out of those 1 of 4 people that are plagued with depression, they 80% of those folks do not receive treatment or care. And we
Mm.
know, statistically, we know by the research that when people receive care, their symptoms and distress are greatly reduced. And the causes for depression are important to talk about. The causes can include hormonal changes, biological experiences like illness, like comorbidity, environmental factors. Like if you are going to lose your home, are you are likely to experience depression. And also neurological impacts like traumatic brain injuries can cause depression, as well as trauma. Emotional and mental, physical trauma can uh, impact and cause depression. But the cause that I most see in the work that I do around depression is what I call a severing or a rupture of one's self to their core
Mm.
identity or their authentic identity. And when I think about what is it, what is a core identity, what is an authentic identity, I think about it in kind of our Christian tradition, and I would probably describe it as like Imago Dei, made in the image of God, where there is this deep knowing, this deep understanding in one's body that
Mm.
they are worthy and good and holy and wonderfully and fearfully made. Henry Nouwen would describe this authentic self as this deep inner knowing that one might have. And so when one is connected to this core self, to this authentic self, they feel aligned, they feel calm, they feel at peace. And I really believe that people can experience this at, as young children. But what usually severs or ruptures that are these outside voices, these outside messages, these expectations that come from society at large, from church community, from our families that say that who we are and who we want to be and who we feel called to be in the world is not acceptable.
Mhm.
That self is rejected. And so I see this rupture and this severing go deep into people's bodies, which make it difficult for them to feel that sense of worthiness, and it impacts them psychologically. They have psychological impacts where all those symptoms that I described are symptoms that they experience
Mhm.
because of the wounding of that severing and that rupture. And I'll just keep going because I want to talk a little bit about what a rupture and a severing means from a perspective of internalized depression. Frantz Fanon, who is a brilliant psychologist who did his work around colonialization and
Mm.
how colonized people were impacted psychologically. And he talked about this as internalized oppression, where he believed that the colonizer not only sought to strip people of their lands, but the colonizer sought to inhabit people's minds and their bodies. Because when you can inhabit people's minds and their bodies, you can control people. It's easier to take away people's resources. And what happens when we internalize that kind of oppression? We feel like our dignity and our worthiness is stripped from us. And another researcher, a Filipino researcher named E.J.R. David, he studied Frantz Fanon and he continued to build on this theory and talked about it as colonial mentality, in which the oppressed person sees themselves through the lens of the oppressor. And so the person begins to think of themselves as less than. They think of themselves as inferior because that's what they've been told and that's what they begin to believe. And so I think one of the aspects that gets overlooked in our faith communities is understanding how systemic oppression is linked to depression. Like I've had some therapists, I work with other therapists, and we talk about how the DSM got it wrong. But we're not talking about depression, we're talking about oppression. But the DSM has not caught up to us yet. And so that's one thing that we need to really understand is that what we see in a person's mental health and what shows up psychologically is a response to what they're experiencing
Mhm.
in society, in the church, in their families, especially when they've been ostracized, rejected, and marginalized.
You,
And we need to understand as a church that that is a deeply painful experience, and that should evoke compassion. That should evoke a sense of wanting to reach out and care for that person. Um, just to know that somebody could be suffering like that among us should evoke a deep sense of compassion.
amen. Let me interject just a couple of things right there. I think that particularly my experience has been in the church. And my experience, not only as a therapist before I was a therapist, the work that I did throughout the state of California, particularly the church doesn't want to talk about it. I'm not talking about mental illness. I'm talking about emotional well-being. And
Yeah,
particularly right now in the world that we are with the stressors of the current administration, where people don't know if their health care is going to be here tomorrow. They don't know if they can feed their family tomorrow. They don't know if they're going to be able to pay their bills tomorrow. There is a lot of what I call distress. And what I'm hoping that we can do in some of this conversation is keep people from moving distress to despair, which takes them in a deep dark pit of depression. So with that said, Reverend Doctor, first off, why do you think, number one, it's hard for people, particularly in faith communities? And I think I already kind of said that because I know people wanted to, oh, let's just pray for everybody. Oh man, I want to just say, come on, y'all. um, they oftentimes folks don't want to openly talk about it because, and let me ask you if this is your experience, because they think they don't have enough faith, or they're not praying enough, or they're not reading enough, or they're not this enough, and they're not that enough. And it has nothing to do with that, y'all. Nothing to do with that. Why do you think it's hard for faith communities to, first off, have this conversation? And with that, what are some of the ways depression shows up differently in marginalized or oppressed groups?
okay.
I think you talked a little
Well,
bit about the oppression,
I
the
did.
colonization, those
Yeah.
things. But let's be
And
specific to our audience
yeah,
tonight.
I want to talk about that a little bit more because there is a deep history, a long history where mental health has been weaponized
Absolutely.
against marginalized people. And I want to kind of share a little bit of the history of that because I think that part of the problem, part of the reason why we don't talk about this in our churches is because we have a lot of misunderstanding about what mental health is, what depression is, what mental illness is.
Right.
Um, we get a lot of misinformation. It's in our our media. There's misrepresentations and misinformation about mental health all of the time that we're inundated with. And so people don't understand it. And I think deep down, when we don't have an understanding for something, we naturally fear that something. You
Yeah.
know, we don't know what to do with it. We fear it. And so we don't want to believe that somebody could have that, so we might dismiss it. Or we don't know what the answers are to help that person with whatever they're experiencing. And so we tend to say things like, maybe if you prayed more, maybe if you had more faith, maybe if are
Come
you
on
are
now.
you obedient to God? Are you trusting God? These kinds of things. And I think that tends to drive people into more hiding spaces where they don't feel like they can actually come forward and be really honest about what they're experiencing. I think also people don't want to be judged. They don't want to be judged in their churches. For some people, church is their lifeline. It's like it's their main thing, and they're the place where they have community, where their best friends go, where their pastor who has, baptized them and confirmed them and, been through all these seasons of their life with them. They don't want their pastor to think differently of them. They don't want their community to think differently of them. I think of B.B. Moore Campbell, who is an African American writer. She established National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, and she said, well, everyone, all colors, everyone is affected by stigma. No one wants to say, I'm not in control of my mind. No one wants to say, the person I love is not in control of their mind. But people of color really don't want to say it because we are already feel stigmatized by virtue of skin color or eye shape or accent. And we don't want any more reasons for anyone to say that we're not good enough. So we don't want to be judged. I also think that we haven't learned how to talk about mental health. Like we don't even know how to talk about it. And I'll give an example. When my brother was 19 years old, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
Mm.
And, he would disappear and he would reappear, and he was in and out of the hospitals, and it was a really challenging time. And we got a lot of this similar feedback from the church about prayer and his faith life and all these things.
Mm.
My family didn't know how to respond. They are Christian. They had some of the same kinds of comments and things. But one of the most interesting aspects about that is that as we were learning about my brother's condition, my grandmother started to share with me that when my grandfather was 20, he also had similar symptoms, and he would
Wow.
disappear for days, and then he'd come back, and then he'd be really depressed and he couldn't get out of bed, and then he'd go manic, and I just thought, oh my God, if we had been able to talk about this, imagine what
Yeah.
how different the experience could have been for my brother and how different it could have been for our family. And I think part of why we struggle to talk about it in church is because we don't know how to talk about it. And I think part of how we get around that is we have to start realizing that mental health is just part of our humanity. It's just part of what it means to be human. And to your question about how depression shows up differently in marginalized and oppressed groups, I just want to say that I think that it's not the symptoms that look different. I think what is different is the treatment and the access that
Woo!
marginalized people have to care. There is an entire history, a whole history of discrimination and oppression within our mental health care systems in the United States. The
Absolutely.
first documented case of mental health illness is dated back to 1900 BC, where
Wow.
women were diagnosed with a condition called hysteria. This was in ancient Greece.
Right.
And hysteria was believed to be a disease that was rooted in the uterus. And the Greek word
Listen,
hysteria
y'all. Listen.
means uterus. And a diseased uterus was considered to be toxic, and it caused anxiety, tremors, and convulsions. And it was believed that hysteria was passed down from a mother to a daughter through the uterus. Now, Freud, as many of y'all are familiar with that name, and a lot of our Western conceptualizations and psychology come from Freud's theories. Freud started to study hysteria in his patients that he was seeing, and he defined hysteria as a condition of repressed pain, meaning that we see distress when people have had to push and submerge down pain. And he really began to believe this because he was working with women who were describing being sexually assaulted, some
Mm.
by their fathers, some by their brothers, some by uncles, by family friends. And he started to link the sexual abuse and sexual trauma to this condition of hysteria. And he wrote some papers about it. But it was so publicly controversial that Freud actually recanted. He recanted those statements and those findings and said that this was all his patient's condition that he named penis envy, a fantasy for abuse.
Mhm.
That his theories, Freud's theories, have been included in the construction of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that we still use to this
Today.
day. If we go further in our history, what we see with hysteria is that it became a diagnosis for white women. Whiteness was actually became a prerequisite for this diagnosis. So it was believed that hysteria was a result of over civilization, whereas Black and Indigenous women's psychological distress was viewed as a problem resulting in too much freedom. It was theorized, there was a name for this that they called drapetomania, which was a mental disease of the mind that drove enslaved people to run away. So Black women were being diagnosed with lunacy, idiocy, and epilepsy when they were distressed because of the pain and the trauma that they were suffering. But white women were diagnosed with hysteria. Psychiatric care weaponized mental health to justify institutionalizing Black women and to reinforcing segregation and slavery in this country. The legacy of systematic oppression and the weaponization of mental health ripples through our collective consciousness. We've all now normalized this. We've normalized that this binary that if you are mentally well, then you are good and you are normal and you are acceptable and you're worthy. And if you are experiencing mental illness or depression, then you are bad, abnormal, and not acceptable to society. We have normalized that. And so we have part of breaking through the stigma is breaking through the binary. There is no binary. Mental health is a spectrum. We go through various different seasons in our mental health all throughout our lifespan. And we have to get to a place where we can humanize that in our communities.
And make it real that everybody can talk about it. We have to create those spaces. Uh,
Absolutely.
you know, yes, Minister Sandy, thank you. She says, and sometimes when a clergy person is challenged with depression, there may be shame attached to it. It absolutely is.
Yes, ma'am.
But until we have those honest conversations with one another and can be vulnerable to say, look, this is where I'm at, this is it, and then not feel shame, but feel supported and loved and cared for, we're going to be in this same box year after year.
Absolutely. I would also add to this, Bishop Bonnie, that for folks of color, for marginalized people, it has not always been safe to seek
Yep.
care and treatment and support. So we need more therapists of color. We need more therapists who are trained in cultural competence and understand this history and understand how to navigate it in safe and humanizing ways that do not exclude that narrative from the reality of what we're dealing with in our mental health today.
So true. So true. And, when I came to Nevada after the mass shooting of 2017, one of the first things we did was created a whole cultural competency training piece that we made folks who were in any kind of healthcare, any kind of first responders. They were required by law now to go through this cultural competency
Mm.
training. Well, let's try to move on to a couple of things. I want to just say this before we move on. One of the things that I want to particularly take a moment to acknowledge, something that I think is incredibly important. Research continues to show us that particularly members of the LGBTQIA plus community experience depression, anxiety, and suicide risk at significant higher rates. Not because, listen, y'all who are listening to me, who are in this community with me, not because of who you are or who they are, but because of the pain that we've experienced of rejection, because of the discrimination and the isolation that we've faced over and over again as people of faith and people of compassion. It's our sacred calling, beloved, to create spaces, I believe, where LGBTQIA individuals can feel safe, can feel seen, can feel affirmed, um, and loved without conditions, because healing happens where belonging begins. Let me say that again. Healing happens where belonging begins. I tell folks all the time, you need a pit crew. You need a stretcher bearers around you. I don't know what I would do without those voices in my life today. They do that. Let me bring a follow-up question to that to you, Reverend Doctor. Your work deeply. You talked about it. I talked about this in your bio. Engages the BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities. What have you seen? What have you seen as some of the most effective ways faith communities can support mental wellness among marginalized communities, the LGBTQIA plus community individuals, especially those who have been hurt by religion itself?
Yeah. Well, I want to bring some statistics to what you were sharing earlier, Bishop Bonnie, because I think it helps to kind of contextualize and understand, kind of the weight that our LGBTQ community is holding in this time, particularly in this time when we're seeing rights being ripped away, when we're seeing um, transgender people losing health care and losing gender affirming care. Like that is ultimately going to impact someone's mental health. We know that body dysphoria, gender dysphoria is part of the experience that one has when they're seeking to receive gender affirming care so that they can feel aligned in their identity. And it's a deeply personal and a deeply vulnerable and intimate decision and steps to make. And so to see this kind of attack and assault on transgender people is, is affects this community deeply. The statistics show us that 79% of transgender youth experience depression versus 40% in cisgender youth. And 40% is a lot in any community, but 79%.
Right.
That's astronomical. 59% of transgender youth have considered suicide versus 28% of their cisgender youth counterpart. And 22% of transgender youth have attempted suicide versus 6%. These are big, big numbers. And I think so preventable because a lot of the reason why we see these numbers so high is because of how society and community have rejected our transgender community. Um, Even now, we've seen 26 states pass laws banning gender affirming care. The
Right.
Supreme Court is preparing to hear a case that would make conversion therapy legal again after years and years of advocating against conversion therapy and all that we know and all the harm that has happened as a result of conversion therapy. They're getting ready to hear another case on that. Even here in January, after Trump took office, Uh, I live in Seattle. It's a very progressive city. Um, our gender clinic here decided to roll back their gender affirming care. I
Oh,
had clients and patients calling me and saying, after years of getting documentation and preparing mentally, emotionally, spiritually for this next leg in their journey, they're being told that they're not going to be able to receive that affirming care. And
wow.
so, and in addition to that, Christian nationalists are emboldened to come into our communities, into our cities. We had a Christian nationalist group come into our queer community here in the Capitol Hill neighborhood and set up a revival that they were calling Save the Kids. And they were spouting all this basically transphobic, hate speech towards this
Horrible.
community. We had hundreds of trans youth show up to counter protest, and the city called the police to come and to protect the Christian nationalists. And so, as clergy, we showed up to one to send a message that what they're hearing is a lie and heresy, that is not of God, that God loves them, that God beloves them, that they are wonderfully and fearfully made in the image of God. And two, to physically form a line between the youth that we were serving and the police to provide protection. And so the reason why I'm giving all of these examples is some of the ways that I'm seeing that we need to show up as a faith community is actually showing up in the streets is going to be really important at this time.
Listen, folks.
Using our voice, you know, um, making safe places in our congregational spaces, um, opening up our homes. There are people that have been calling us that are coming from other states that need to come into a city or a state where they can receive gender affirming care, but they don't have connections here. So it may mean that we have to open up our homes, open up our sanctuaries so that
Yes.
people can safely make it into the city and receive the care that they need. We need to call our legislators. We need to call our representatives.
Come
We
on,
need
y'all.
to, be active in those ways so that we are advocating and continuing to fight for the rights of our LGBTQIA community because um, ultimately there is a direct coalition from what is happening politically and the stripping away of people's rights to how people are being impacted in their mental health. And those are ways as faith communities that we can show up meaningfully to help protect those that are most vulnerable in our community.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you're on Breaking the Silence with Bishop Bonnie. Our guest tonight is a Reverend Dr. DeAnza Spaulding, and just an amazing human being. Let's talk about you're working on a book that we titled a moment ago. What if I told you there was nothing wrong with you? Tell us what inspired that message, and what do you hope people will take from it when that book is released? And maybe you can tell us when it might be released.
Okay. Well, I was inspired to write this book like directly out of the work that I do. I've had a private practice for 20 years now. I'm also a domestic violence advocate, and I've done research in that field as well as advocacy work and developing programs to help um, families and women that are experiencing domestic violence. And and so that title, "What If I Told You There Was Nothing Wrong with You," really came out of these conversations that I was having regularly with people that were saying, Dr. DeAnza, can you just tell me what is wrong with me? And then
Uh,
they were describing what they were experiencing and they were telling me their stories. And I would literally look at them and I would say, well, it doesn't sound like to me like anything is wrong with you. It sounds to me like your brain is doing what it's wired to do, and that is to protect and to keep you safe and to help you to survive. And so I actually would bring out a brain model like I'm doing today Because what I realized is that so much of our human processes are invisible to the naked eye. We can't actually see what's happening in
Right.
our brain. So we don't
Right.
believe that it's happening. We believe it's something that we're doing wrong, right? So we'd actually bring a brain model. And funny story, Bishop, I had to do a workshop in another country, in another city, and I was flying in TSA, and they flagged my luggage, and the TSA worker pulled me aside and said, "Hey, wait a second. It looks like there's a brain in your luggage." And I said, "Yes, there is.
Ah,
There is a brain in
there is one in there. What do you mean? Looks like.
there." But I
That's
bring
funny.
that out because then I walk through the different areas of a person's brain. And so when you're experiencing a traumatic event, what gets activated is this little, it's a very small mechanism in our brain called the limbic system. And the limbic system has this this piece that's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is sometimes described by some neuropsychologists as the smoke detector. So when something threatening happens to us, when something harmful happens to us, it it indicates so in the amygdala. So the amygdala sounds an alarm, right? And it lets off this message that you are in threat. And so what do we need to do when we're in threat? We need to survive. And our survival responses are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, right? And so when that happens, that's why we go into sometimes these states where we feel frozen or where we feel super activated, like we want to run. And when people have that experience, sometimes in some situations, the amygdala doesn't turn off. And when that happens, we have a condition called post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mhm.
And that means that the amygdala stays on, and we have constant cortisol and adrenaline being flushed through our bodies. And we're constantly in this state of vigilance and hypervigilance to stay safe, cycling through fight and flight. At a certain point, our bodies can't sustain that, and things start to shut down. And some of the things that happen in trauma response is our frontal cortex turns off. That's the part of our brain where we do all of our organized thinking, where we like, it's like a file cabinet where we file away information. That turns off. There's certain systems in our brains that turn off to reserve energy for survival. And a lot of those correlate with symptoms of depression. So when people started describing to me these things and then telling me their stories and what they experienced, I was like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with you. Your brain is doing what it was wired to do. Let me show you. Let me show you what that looks like. And I would show that to them. And it would
Wow.
be like these light bulb moments going off and people feeling this relief like, oh, they're not a deviant, they're not abnormal, they're not a horrible person. They're
Hmm.
just needing to learn what it means to take care of a brain that is very, very activated. And there's ways that we can treat that when that happens. So that's what this whole book is about. And I do a lot of work around trauma. Again, it started out of the work that I do as a domestic violence advocate and sexual assault advocate, but that branched out to working with the LGBTQIA community as well as the BIPOC community. I'm Filipino. Um, I'm, I think for a lot of folks of color, they're not aware of how intergenerational trauma and how internalized oppression
Yeah.
show up in their day-to-day lives. And so that's what this whole book is about. And my hope is that people receive the information they need to understand their humanity and stop blaming themselves and understand that their bodies and their brains are doing what they are wired to do. And it just takes some understanding so that we can work with our brains and our bodies. And ultimately, I hope that helps to destigmatize the conversation around mental health and that we can have more open dialogues around this, more accepting dialogues around this.
When do you anticipate that book to be released?
I hope next year. I'm actually writing two books right now. I'm writing that book, and I'm writing a book called Story Healing, Reclaiming Our Bodies from Racial Trauma, for BIPOC women. And that one's more of kind of like a handbook. There will be like activities and exercises in that book that people
Awesome.
can work through. And this book here, what if I told you there was nothing wrong with you? We'll have more of like the historical pieces about around mental health and how mental health has been weaponized and what that has looked like and how we can overcome that.
Awesome. Well, most of our audience is faith-based audience, and so I want to address a few questions in our last few minutes that we have together. Um, how can faith communities become safer and more responsive places for people navigating mental illness, mental wellness struggles, emotional well-being? How can we become safer and more responsive places?
Yeah, it's an important question. I think one, I think learn about mental health, learn about your brain, learn about these invisible systems that you know, take up a lot of that use a lot of energy in our bodies. Like really come to a place of understanding, understand your own mental health, learn to humanize your own mental health. And you know, that's really the starting place is yourself. Because if we have stigma in our communities, oftentimes that's projected from our own sense of shame or stigma that we've internalized. So I really encourage people to get to a place where they can accept where they are in their mental health and what that means for them, and humanize that. I think finding ways we have to learn as faith communities how to talk about mental health. You know, I I'm a pastor, as you all know, and one of the things that we do every single week is I do something called the grounding activity where I literally every week say, your body is holy, good, and sacred. Your
Wow.
body is good and holy and sacred. And then we talk about all the things
Mhm.
that we're carrying in our bodies and in our minds, and that fundamentally the truth that our bodies are holy and good and sacred don't change. That
Mhm.
the fundamental truth that we are fearfully and wonderfully made doesn't change because of what we're carrying in our mental health or on our bodies. If anything, it makes us that much more lovable and beloved and adored and cherished and precious in God's sight. And so creating this kind of openness lets people share at their own comfort level where they are at.
Mm.
And I've started as a pastor, I talk a lot about about mental health in my sermons, but I've also brought the brain to some of the services and sermons that I've done and actually brought out the brain to discuss how the brain works and how it impacts us day to day. Because that's a way of humanizing, again, our mental health and making it more comfortable and kind of like we can have a better understanding and more awareness around it. I would say get to know therapists and folks that do work around mental health in your area so that as people come to you and they're struggling, you don't have to be the expert. You don't have to be the one that's,
Right.
treating them and treating whatever condition that they have. In fact, you probably shouldn't if you're not trained in that. But if you have relationships with people in your community, therapists and other folks that do that work, you can help create that bridge of connection for folks to get those resources and to
Right.
receive that care that they need. I would say be open to, if people when people share with you what they're going through, be open to going to whatever extent you need to support them. So there's been times that I've had members of my church come to me who have been dealing with suicidality, and I said, you know what? Let's figure out a care plan together. What does that
Right.
look like? And sometimes it's come to the place where they're like, well, I feel like I need to go to the hospital, but I don't want to go alone. Well, I will go with you. essentially what I'm communicating is that it doesn't matter what they're going through. I am here, and my love isn't going to change for them.
Right.
I am committed to their health, whatever it takes. Right. And so being able to show up in those ways, people feel, kind of skittish about sharing about their mental health. But sometimes then when they do share and they're just received, it's like, oh, okay, I hear you. Wow. How can I support you? It just melts away all of this, the layers of shame that have been building over time, and they can feel this relief of being seen and being heard. And then finally, one of the things that we've done at our church is we've established a mutual aid fund
Ah,
that where we are actually collecting resources so that folks that need, as you know, and Bishop Bonnie already referenced this, like there's so many changes that are going on. We're in a government shutdown right now.
right.
Healthcare is all over the place. People need not only connections to those resources, but they actually might need support so that they
Right.
can access those connections uh, financially. So a mutual aid fund allows a church to be able to support people with either, helping them pay for so many therapy appointments or whatever it might be. You kind of can construct it whatever way it needs to look to the context in which you're in. But those are really practical ways that you can make mental health inclusive in your communities and safe to talk about or to reach out and seek support in your church.
Right. One of the things I want to address just before we close tonight is that if you are watching us tonight and you're struggling with depression right now, the first thing I want to say is there's nothing wrong with your faith. I want to say that to you right now. Because one of the things I know is naming our pain is faith. And it's
Yeah.
where it's how healing begins. Let me say that
Mm-hmm.
again.
Mm-hmm.
Naming our pain is a form of faith. And if
Absolutely.
you're struggling tonight in a place of deep depression, or you're just struggling with depression, maybe, just what's happening in the world, you may need to turn the TV off. For me, I don't watch news anymore. I just don't watch it. I
Mm-hmm.
get a few
Yeah.
things here or there, but you know what? And one of the things that I did last year is my phone goes off, Reverend Doctor, every hour and says, it used to say gratitude, right now it says sacred pause. And I
Mm-hmm.
take a sacred pause for Bonnie Radden, just a sacred pause every hour. Just whatever that means to you, you may need to do that. But if you
Yeah.
tonight, if we have some folks who may be watching us tonight, in closing, that are
Mm-hmm.
struggling right now with depression, Reverend
Yeah.
Doctor, what's the one thing you want them to know besides what I just shared? What would you want them to know?
Your body, your body, your body is holy and good and sacred. Your mind is holy and good and sacred. You are wonderfully and fearfully made. You are not alone. You are not alone. You are not alone. It's not in your head. It's not in your head. It's not in your head. And there is care and support for you. And Bishop, I didn't put it together yet, but I can send it to you a list of resources, books and other resources that might be helpful for folks who are looking to establish something in their faith community or know of somebody who could use that support.
That would be wonderful. And if you're interested in that, please drop us a message. My email is bishopradden at gmail.com. And I'm going to put that up in just a moment. I want to say this, and again, if you're struggling tonight, if you're really struggling, a few things: call somebody, and you say, I don't have somebody to call. There are several numbers that you could call. There's a 988 number that you can call. Folks are there 365 days, all day and night, night and day, that can talk to you. I'm afraid to talk to somebody that I know. I remember when I first sought therapy years and years ago, I said, I don't want to go anywhere where anybody knows me spiritually. I don't want to go where someone knows me. But now I'm very, very grateful for a therapist. And I have a therapist who's not only a certified therapist and education and licensed, but additionally, they're also very spiritual. And that was something I need. And, and you say, well, you know what, Bishop, I can't afford it, or I don't have it. There's a number of ways that we can connect you with different spaces and different places. You can reach out again to me at bishopbraden@gmail.com. DM me on my Facebook page. Reverend Doctor is going to get us some other resources. But know this. I think that healing begins, really, 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 really begins when we remember that we are not alone. When you say, what do you mean? We're not alone. You may think you're alone. You may feel like you're alone right now, but you're really not alone. There is someone who is willing to bring you into circle. I'm working with, I was just sharing a little bit with Reverend Doctor before we came on, and with a piece, and it's all called Whole Community Health, where it's therapists, it's health educators, it's faith-based, that are all together, coming together in a circle of care, where we can be honest, where we can share, we can heal, we can be vulnerable. But I want you to know tonight, in closing, you are not alone. You are not alone. And that there's no shame in needing help.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we have to just reach out and say, help. I remember a long time ago, our presiding bishop said, my greatest prayer was help.
Yeah.
There is no shame in needing help. And depression is not failure, again, of faith. It's not because you don't have enough faith. It's not because you're not doing all of those quote unquote spiritual things. The church has put that on you. God didn't do that, beloved. God did not do that. Depression is not a failure of faith. It's a call for care.
Yes.
A call for care. I want to thank you again tonight, Reverend Dr. DeAnza Spaulding. And as she has reminded us again tonight, takes a whole lot of courage and compassion, to make those bridges from silence to strength. Why don't you give a closing remark as we get ready to close up here in just a moment? Anything you want to share with the audience?
I just sitting with those words, that you're not alone. There is a community that you can Google called Inclusive Therapists. They are therapists. I'm part of this network. We're all over the US, the United States. And there are resources there as well. They have a liberation fund to help people who need support with financially being able to access therapy. So that might be a resource that could be very helpful to you. And I am really sitting with naming our pain is faith. It truly is. And it does take courage to name our pain because of the vulnerability and the fear that we face. And I also know that there is incredible healing that comes when we name and when we are honest with ourselves. There is incredible healing that we experience as a result. And so my thoughts are with you, my prayers are with you and your communities. And I look forward to many more conversations like this.
Amen. And know that we will continue to have these conversations monthly. We're going to have a conversation on the 30th of October around how depression affected those of us who've gone through breast cancer. And I have 3 folks coming on, myself, who are survivors, and
Mm,
uh,
that's
and we're
important.
excited about that. November 30th, October 30th. Mark your calendars, same time, 5 p.m. And then on November 13th, we're going to be interviewing Dr. Teresa Smallwood, who is a dean at Lutheran University. She was with us this summer in TFAM, and we're going to be
Mm,
talking about her book, as well as we're going to be talking about theological education in these distressing times. What is it? Why? And how can you access lots of education that's available out there to you at no cost, beloved? I'm here to share with you.
mm,
So again, you've been with us tonight. If you'd like to keep us and keep breaking the silence on, you can give to us by giving to us via Cash App, or via, I'm going to scroll it over there, Cash App, $ Bishop Radden, or Zelle. My phone number there. Also, you can reach out to me via phone if there's a need that you have tonight. You need someone to talk to. We'll get that. I will get the website of the inclusive therapist so that we can post that. I'll post that on my Facebook page and my YouTube channel. And again, we love you tonight. And in closing, as always, I want to say now, unto him, unto them, unto she, who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. Let me say this. May truth, your truth, your truth, come on, guide you tonight beyond the silence, beyond the stigma, into the strength of community, compassion, and divine healing. You've been on Breaking the Silence with Bishop Bonnie. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Reverend Doctor. We love you, and so glad to have you. Folks, we love you. We'll see you soon. God bless you.